For over 3,300 years, it sat in the dark, sealed inside a tomb carved into the limestone cliffs of the Valley of the Kings, buried beneath layer after layer of linen wrappings, locked inside a nest of 3 golden coffins, untouched and unseen by any living eye. The most famous face in all of human history, 22 pounds of solid gold staring at nothing in a silence that lasted 32 centuries. And when scientists finally brought the most advanced imaging technology ever applied to this object, scanners that can see through gold, read erased inscriptions, detect differences in metal composition invisible to the naked eye, and map the internal structure of an artifact without touching a single atom of its surface, what they found did not just surprise them. It did not just raise new questions. It rewrote the identity of the most iconic artifact ever pulled from the ground. Because the name inscribed on that mask, the name carved into the cartouche that was supposed to identify its owner for eternity, was not always Tutankhamun. It was someone else's face, someone else's name, someone else's mask. And the boy king the entire world has been looking at for a century was, in a very real and scientifically verifiable sense, wearing a disguise. This is the story of what the science actually found, and it is more extraordinary than any fiction. Let us begin not with the scan, but with the moment the mask was first seen by modern eyes. Because that moment, November the 4th, 1922, contains a detail that set the stage for everything that followed and that almost nobody noticed at the time. British archaeologist Howard Carter had been searching the Valley of the Kings for years. Funded by the wealthy English aristocrat Lord Carnarvon, Carter had dug and excavated through the Egyptian desert with the increasingly desperate conviction that the tomb of a relatively obscure boy pharaoh from the 18th dynasty still lay undiscovered somewhere beneath the sand. Every other major excavator had declared the valley exhausted. They had found everything there was to find, the consensus said. Carter disagreed. On the morning of November the 4th, a young water boy working at the excavation site stumbled, literally stumbled, on a stone step cut into the bedrock. Carter's team carefully cleared the sand to reveal a staircase, 16 steps, and at the bottom, a sealed doorway bearing the royal necropolis seal of the Valley of the Kings. Carter sent a telegram to Carnarvon in England. At last have made wonderful discovery in Valley. He then waited. He waited for his patron to travel from England before he would open the door. That restraint, in the heat of an Egyptian November, knowing that something extraordinary lay inches away behind a 3,000-year-old wall, is either the most disciplined act in the history of archaeology or the most agonizing. On November the 26th, with Carnarvon beside him, Carter made a small opening in the sealed doorway and held a candle through the gap. Carnarvon, standing behind him in the darkness, asked, "Can you see anything?" Carter's response became one of the most famous sentences in the history of human discovery. "Yes," he said, "wonderful things." What he saw, stretching before him in the flickering candlelight, was an entire royal world preserved in miniature. Gold everywhere, gilded furniture, alabaster vessels, ritual objects stacked with the urgency of people packing in a hurry, filling the tomb of a pharaoh who had died too young, too suddenly, with whatever could be assembled in time. Carter would spend the next 10 years cataloging and removing the contents of that tomb, but it was not until the innermost chamber, the burial chamber itself, was breached on February the 17th, 1923, that the world saw what lay at the heart of everything. Inside 3 nested coffins, the innermost of solid gold, lay the mummified body of the boy king, and resting over his face, placed there 3,200 years before Carter lifted it into the light of the 20th century, was the mask. The Mask of Tutankhamun is not just famous. It is, as Nicholas Reeves, one of the world's leading authorities on Tutankhamun and the 18th dynasty, has described it, not only the quintessential image from Tutankhamun's tomb, but perhaps the best-known object from ancient Egypt itself. It is 54 centimeters tall. It weighs 10.23 kilograms, just over 22.5 pounds of solid gold. The face is serene, idealized, eternally young. The striped Nimes headcloth falls in the traditional royal style. The eyes are obsidian and quartz, ringed with lapis lazuli, staring forward with the impassive authority of divinity. A braided ceremonial beard hangs from the chin. Inlaid bands of lapis lazuli, carnelian, feldspar, turquoise, and colored glass run across the collar and headdress in geometric patterns of extraordinary precision. It is a masterpiece, a summit of human craftsmanship, an object so beautiful that a century after its discovery, it still stops people in their tracks when they see it for the first time. And it is now housed at the Grand Egyptian Museum in Cairo, a building whose construction took over 2 decades, whose central atrium was designed specifically around the requirement to display a 12-meter granite statue of Rameses the Great in a way that does not overshadow it, the kind of reverence that tells you everything about the cultural weight of what lives inside. For 103 years after Howard Carter lifted the mask from the inner coffin of Tutankhamun, the world accepted it on its surface. That gold face was Tutankhamun. The inscription on the back identified the owner. The cartouche bore his name. End of story. Case closed. Move on. Except that Carter himself, when he first examined the mask in 1922, noticed something that he wrote down and then apparently decided not to pursue. He noted holes in the ears of the mask, piercing holes, the kind made to hang earrings. He documented the observation, and then, in the overwhelming task of cataloging and removing thousands of objects from 4 chambers packed with the accumulated treasures of a royal burial, the earring holes were noted and filed and forgotten. For decades. The first serious crack in the mask's accepted identity came not from a laboratory, but from a pair of eyes that had spent a career looking at 18th dynasty Egyptian art, until every convention, every artistic rule, every expected form was as familiar as the back of a hand. Nicholas Reeves, British Egyptologist, spent years building a comprehensive photographic archive of every object from Tutankhamun's tomb. In 2015, he was examining high-definition images of the mask, images taken with precision photography equipment that allowed him to study the hieroglyphics at a resolution and angle that no previous researcher had been able to achieve, when he saw something that stopped him cold. The cartouche, the oval royal name stamp that identifies the owner of a funerary object for eternity. On the back of the mask, running down the collar, the cartouches spelled out the name Tutankhamun in hieroglyphs. But when Reeves looked at those cartouches under enhanced imaging and at the precise lighting angle the new photographs provided, he saw something beneath the surface inscription. Traces, ghost marks, the faint remnant outline of different hieroglyphs underneath the ones that declared the mask to belong to Tutankhamun. Someone had changed the name, not clumsily, not obviously, with enough skill that 3,000 years of human eyes looking at this object had not caught it. But the ghost of the original inscription was still there, barely visible, scratched into the gold beneath the replacement cartouche like a palimpsest, the medieval term for a manuscript page that was scraped clean and reused, but still carries the shadow of its previous writing for those who look closely enough. Reeves published his findings on Academia. Edu, writing with the controlled precision of a man who understood exactly how provocative his claim was. Blinded by the piece's sheer beauty and enormous bullion worth, he wrote, "The world has looked, and yet has completely failed to see, that the gold mask had never been intended for Tutankhamun at all." Those words detonated inside the world of Egyptology like a carefully placed charge. Because if the cartouche had been altered, if there was truly another name underneath the one the world had been reading for a century, then the most famous artifact ever found in Egypt was not what it claimed to be. It was borrowed, or taken, or repurposed in such urgent haste that the craftsman who changed the name left traces that would survive 3 millennia, waiting for someone to look closely enough. To understand why the mask might have been made for someone else, and who that someone else might have been, you need to understand the extraordinary, turbulent, almost unbelievable period of Egyptian history that surrounded Tutankhamun's birth, his reign, and his death. The 18th dynasty of ancient Egypt produced some of the most powerful and enigmatic rulers in the entire 3,000-year history of Egyptian civilization. But no reign was more radical, more disruptive, or more thoroughly erased by those who came after than that of Akhenaten, the pharaoh who ruled Egypt for roughly 17 years, beginning around 1353 BCE. Akhenaten did something that had never been done before and would never quite be done again in Egyptian history. He abolished the entire Egyptian pantheon. He declared that there was only one god, the Aten, the physical disk of the sun, and he, Akhenaten, was the Aten's sole earthly representative. He moved the capital of Egypt from Thebes to a new city built from scratch in the desert, which he called Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten. He ordered the names of other gods chiseled from temple walls across the country. He redirected the vast religious economy of Egypt away from the priesthood of Amun and toward his new solar cult. He upended everything. And by his side throughout this religious revolution stood one of the most famous women in human history, Nefertiti, chief royal wife, mother of 6 daughters, co-regent, by some scholarly interpretations, in the later years of Akhenaten's reign. The woman whose limestone bust, discovered in 1912 in the workshop of the royal sculptor Thutmose, and now housed in the Neues Museum in Berlin, has become, alongside Tutankhamun's mask, one of the 2 most instantly recognizable faces from the ancient world. What happened to Nefertiti after Akhenaten's death is one of the great unsolved mysteries of Egyptology. She disappears from the historical record. Some scholars believe she died. Others believe she continued to rule after Akhenaten, either as his co-regent during his final years or as an independent pharaoh under the name Neferneferuaten, a female pharaoh whose reign is documented in the historical record but whose identity remains disputed. There is no confirmed tomb, no confirmed mummy. No definitive conclusion to her story. Nefertiti, one of the most powerful women in 3,000 years of ancient Egyptian history, simply vanishes. And that vanishing is directly connected to what the scientific analysis of Tutankhamun's mask found hidden in the gold. When Professor Joanne Fletcher, Egyptologist at the University of York, one of the most respected voices in the field, examined the mask as part of a research project documented by History Hit, she focused on the detail that Howard Carter had noted and then set aside more than a century ago: the earring holes. And what she found, when she combined that physical evidence with a fresh analysis of the mask's material composition, constitutes the strongest scientific case yet assembled that the mask of Tutankhamun was not made for Tutankhamun. Start with the ears. In ancient Egyptian funerary art and royal iconography, earring holes, the physical piercings made in the earlobes of a funerary mask, were associated specifically with women and with children, not with adult male pharaohs. There is no image, no statue, no relief carving, no funerary object depicting an adult Egyptian king with pierced ears. The convention is consistent and clear across the entire archaeological record. Adult male pharaohs did not wear earrings, and their funerary masks did not have piercing holes. The presence of those holes on the mask of Tutankhamun is therefore, on its own, a significant anomaly. It indicates either that the mask was made for someone who wore earrings, a woman or a child, or that the conventions of royal iconography were violated in this specific case for an unknown reason. Professor Fletcher's reading is direct. This mask was not made for an adult male pharaoh, she told researchers. When she compared the gold composition of the mask's faceplate with the rest of the mask, the headdress, the collar, the back panels, she found a discrepancy that confirmed what the physical evidence from Reeves's cartouche analysis already suggested. The face is made of completely different gold to the rest, she said. Not different in a minor manufacturing variance sense, different in a measurable material sense, a difference in gold purity that points to two separate manufacturing events. The face of the mask, the part that depicts the features of Tutankhamun, was produced separately from the headdress, collar, and body of the mask. And evidence of soldering, the physical joining of these two distinct pieces, is visible on the mask's structure. The mask shows clear evidence of soldering, Fletcher stated, as if Tutankhamun's face had been grafted onto the mask of a previous ruler. Grafted. That word carries everything. Not placed, not fitted, grafted. The language of biological intervention, of one organism's tissue being attached to another body, of two things that did not originate together being joined in urgent, functional necessity. The York research team went further. They measured the facial proportions of the mask and compared them with known portraits of Nefertiti. The proportions and the outline of the chin, they noted, matched known portraits of Nefertiti more closely than they matched other portrayals of Tutankhamun. Microscopic studies revealed solder lines joining gold of two different purities, 23.2 carats for the face, 23.5 carats for the headdress and body. An insert at the base of the chin, neatly cut openings at the ears. The conclusion that Fletcher drew from this accumulation of physical evidence was unambiguous. They may have had pierced ears. They may have been a woman. It may well have been Nefertiti. Now, let us bring in the counter-argument, because the honest telling of the story requires you to know that this theory, as powerful as the evidence is not without challenge. And the most important challenge came from someone who had spent more time physically handling the mask than almost anyone alive. Christian Eckman is the metal conservation expert at the Romano-Germanic Central Museum in Mainz, Germany. In 2014, the mask's beard was accidentally broken off during cleaning at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. The repair was botched initially. It was glued back with epoxy in the wrong position. Eckman led the team brought in to correct the repair and conduct the most comprehensive physical examination of the mask, since Carter removed it from Tutankhamun's coffin. He spent weeks working directly with the gold. And his conclusion contradicts Reeves and Fletcher at the most fundamental level. Eckman found no evidence, he said, that the face is composed of different gold than the rest of the mask. He found no signs that the cartouches had been altered, working with the actual object rather than photographs or external measurements, with access to the mask's surfaces at distances and angles unavailable to any other researcher. He maintained that the mask is consistent in its manufacture and that the evidence for alteration and repurposing simply does not hold up under direct physical scrutiny. This is the heart of the scientific dispute. Two sets of highly credible researchers, both working with genuine expertise and genuine methodology, reaching directly opposing conclusions about the same object. Reeves and Fletcher examining photographic and compositional evidence and seeing unmistakable signs of modification. Eckman conducting hands-on conservation work and seeing none. The disagreement is not between serious scholars and fringe theorists. It is between serious scholars and serious scholars. And that is exactly why this question remains open, and exactly why it matters so much. Because the stakes of being right or wrong here are not small. If Reeves and Fletcher are correct, if the mask was indeed made for a female pharaoh, if the cartouche was altered, if Tutankhamun's face was soldered onto a body built for someone else, then everything the world thinks it knows about the most famous artifact in the history of archaeology is incomplete. The boy king's face is real, but the crown, the collar, the headdress that frames that face, all of it originally belonged to someone else, possibly to the woman who has never been found. The woman whose name translates as the beautiful one has come. The woman who stood beside the heretic pharaoh through his revolution and then disappeared into the silence of history without leaving a confirmed tomb, a confirmed mummy, or a confirmed answer to where she went. The evidence beyond the mask itself makes the repurposing theory increasingly difficult to dismiss, because it turns out the mask is not the only object in Tutankhamun's tomb that appears to have been hastily reassigned from a previous owner. Marc Gabolde, a French Egyptologist who has spent decades reconstructing the family relationships and political succession of the Amarna period, successfully demonstrated that a golden pectoral found in Tutankhamun's tomb, the golden pectoral, Carter number 261P1, had its cartouches reinscribed with Tutankhamun's name over the original cartouches of Nefer-Neferuaten. The original inscription identified the owner as Nefer-Neferuaten with the epithet, one who is beneficial for her husband, a phrase that makes grammatical and grammatical sense only for a woman. Gabolde's work on this single object proved, to the satisfaction of a broad consensus of Egyptologists, that Nefer-Neferuaten was a female king who was simultaneously the wife of Akhenaten, and it proved that objects made for her had been recycled into Tutankhamun's burial. The mask was one of several objects. The Wikipedia article on Tutankhamun states it plainly. Many of Tutankhamun's burial goods show signs of being adapted for his use after being originally made for earlier owners, probably Smenkhkare or Nefer-Neferuaten, or both. The recycling of funerary goods was not unprecedented in ancient Egypt. What was unprecedented, what still staggers researchers who think about it carefully, is the scale of the recycling in Tutankhamun's tomb and what it implies about the circumstances of his burial. Tutankhamun died at approximately 18 to 19 years old, suddenly, without an obvious heir, without the years of preparation that an expected royal death allowed. Egyptian royal burials, the construction of a tomb, the preparation of funerary equipment, the creation of coffins, masks, shabtis, amulets, pectorals, and the hundreds of other ritual objects required, normally began when a pharaoh ascended the throne and continued throughout the reign. Tutankhamun had been king for roughly 9 or 10 years when he died. His tomb in the Valley of the Kings is notably and significantly smaller than those of other 18th dynasty pharaohs, occupying what appears to be a side corridor rather than a main royal tomb slot. It was hastily painted. The paint on the tomb's walls was still damp when the burial was sealed, a detail confirmed by the presence of mold that Carter found growing on the walls when he first entered. And the burial goods themselves bear the marks of rushed assembly. Objects adapted from previous owners' equipment, names changed, decorations altered, items that fit imperfectly because they were never designed for the body they were placed with. The picture that emerges from all of this evidence is of a royal court thrown into crisis by the sudden death of a teenage king who was not supposed to die yet, and of officials making decisions under enormous pressure, grabbing what was available, repurposing what was at hand, changing names and sealing tombs, and moving on to the political emergency that followed. The mask was there. It was extraordinary. It was made for a ruler of similar stature during the same period. The face could be replaced. The cartouche could be altered. And the world would never know. Almost. There's a question at the center of this entire story that has never been fully answered, and that the scientific evidence of the mask's repurposing makes more urgent than ever. Where is Nefertiti? No tomb has ever been definitively identified as hers. No mummy has been confirmed as her remains, despite multiple candidates and multiple investigations. The discovery of her famous bust in 1912 in the sculptor Thutmose' workshop in Amarna, perfectly preserved, now one of the most visited objects in any museum in the world, happened not because her tomb was found, but because the workshop was abandoned and the bust was left behind. She herself remains completely, maddeningly absent from the archaeological record after a certain point in Akhenaten's reign. Nicholas Reeves made a second extraordinary claim in 2015 that connects directly to this absence. While studying high-definition scans of the painted walls inside Tutankhamun's burial chamber, he identified what he believed were the outlines of sealed doorways, passages blocked and plastered over, their surface then painted to match the surrounding decoration so perfectly that they had been invisible for 3,000 years. Reeves proposed that behind the north wall of Tutankhamun's burial chamber lies another chamber, and that inside that chamber, her burial equipment still intact and her mummy still present, lies Nefertiti herself. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of the tomb were conducted in 2015 and initially seemed to support Reeves's theory, with scans suggesting anomalies consistent with voids and different fill materials behind the walls. Later, radar surveys in 2018 were less conclusive, with Egyptian authorities and international teams reaching conflicting interpretations of what the scans actually showed. The question of whether a hidden chamber exists behind Tutankhamun's burial chamber walls has not been definitively resolved. The technology to answer it without damaging the tomb exists. The political and institutional complexity of applying that technology to one of the most visited and culturally significant sites in the world has, so far, prevented a final answer. But the possibility remains. The evidence of the mask's repurposing, the evidence of other objects in the tomb bearing erased and replaced cartouches, the evidence of the rushed and incomplete nature of the burial, the evidence of the golden pectoral originally made for Neferneferuaten. All of it points to a royal court managing the aftermath of two successive sudden deaths, Akhenaten's and then Tutankhamun's, while dealing with a political revolution in reverse. The restoration of the old religion, the abandonment of Akhenaten, the deliberate erasure of Akhenaten's name from monuments, the exact same process of name erasure and identity obliteration that Reeves and Fletcher believe was applied to the mask was playing out across the entire country at the same time. Let us be completely precise about what the science has and has not established. Because this is a subject where the line between verified evidence and compelling theory matters enormously, and where honest treatment of that line is what separates genuine understanding from sensationalism. What the science has established beyond reasonable dispute, the mask's earring holes are real and inconsistent with the iconographic conventions of adult male pharaonic funerary art. The gold composition of the faceplate is measurably different from the gold composition of the headdress and body. 23.2 carats versus 23.5 carats. A difference that multiple analytical techniques have detected. Evidence of soldering joining the face to the rest of the mask is visible to researchers examining the physical object. The cartouches on the back of the mask show, under enhanced imaging conditions, traces consistent with earlier inscription beneath the current text. Multiple other objects in Tutankhamun's tomb have been confirmed to carry erased and replaced cartouches of Neferneferuaten, and Tutankhamun's burial bears consistent signs of having been hastily assembled under time pressure. What remains? Disputed. Whether the gold composition difference is significant enough to confirm two separate manufacturing events, or falls within normal variation in ancient goldworking. Whether the traces beneath the cartouches are genuine earlier inscriptions or natural surface characteristics of the gold. Whether the soldering evidence indicates repurposing or standard ancient craft technique. Christian Ekman's direct physical examination found none of the evidence that photographic and compositional analysis identified. And what remains entirely unknown, the original identity of whoever the mask was made for, if not Tutankhamun, whether Neferneferuaten and Nefertiti are the same person, whether a hidden chamber exists behind Tutankhamun's burial chamber walls, whether the original face of the mask, the face that was replaced, if Reeves is correct, by a face depicting Tutankhamun, survives anywhere in the archaeological record or was melted down and destroyed. These unknowns are not a weakness in the story. They are the story. Because they are what make the mask of Tutankhamun, already the most technically extraordinary, most historically significant, most culturally resonant artifact in the world, something even more extraordinary than the world knew a decade ago. Think about what this means for a moment. Not in technical archaeological terms, but in purely human terms. For 3,300 years, a face sat in the darkness of a sealed tomb. A face that was not the face the mask was made for. A face that replaced an original erased face because a boy king died too young and a royal court scrambled to bury him with the dignity his station required in the time that was available. The name was changed. The earring holes were left, perhaps overlooked, perhaps considered insignificant, perhaps simply accepted as the cost of working quickly. And then the tomb was sealed, and the sand covered the entrance, and the world moved on. And the 18th dynasty ended, and the new kingdom ended, and ancient Egypt itself ended, and empires rose and fell, and Christ was born, and Rome fell, and the Middle Ages passed, and the Renaissance bloomed, and the modern world arrived. And through all of it, through every century of human history, between the sealing of that tomb and the moment Howard Carter made a small hole in a plastered doorway and held a candle through, that mask sat in the dark, wearing its altered name, carrying its secret in the ghost marks beneath a cartouche and the composition of two slightly different alloys of gold. It survived, and the science found it, not by luck, by looking, by caring enough to look closely, by refusing to accept the surface answer when the evidence suggested there was more beneath it. That is what Egyptology, at its best, at its most patient, at its most methodical, does. It looks at objects 3,000 years old and asks, what does the evidence actually say? Not what the inscription claims. Not what a century of received wisdom has assumed. What does the evidence actually say? And sometimes, not often, but sometimes, the evidence says something that stops the entire field in its tracks. Something that rewrites not just a catalog entry or a museum label, but the identity of the most famous artifact in the history of human discovery. The Mask of Tutankhamun is still the most extraordinary object ever pulled from the ground. That does not change. But the story it tells, the story of who made it, who it was made for, what was erased and replaced and buried under 22 pounds of gold, that story is considerably richer, considerably more complicated, and considerably more human than the one the world thought it knew. For 3,300 years, the truth was hiding in the gold. And when science finally looked closely enough to find it, Egyptology has not been the same since.